Okay, I think we can get started. Thanks for coming to the seminar. We have a presentation today by Dinesh on overseas migration. So, Dinesh is a PhD student from Nepal here, and you have seen his file. So I don't want to waste time saying more things. The floor is yours, Dinesh.
Thank you, Atakanji. So now I'm going to present one of my thesis chapters entitled Drivers of Overseas Migration, Migration Intensity and Destination Choice Among Farming Households in Nepal. So in this presentation, I will give you some overview about migration and its drivers, and then link it to the Nepalese context and go to my research questions and share you the methodologies that I used for answering the questions and the results and its policy implications. So while talking about migration, migration involves the movement of an individual or group of people from one place to another place, which could be either inside a country or from one country to another country for a variety of reasons. So it is an age-old phenomenon. It is ubiquitous. It is common to every country, and it is central to human history, human civilizations, and human cultures. So since the beginning of human life, human beings have always moved from one place to another place for a variety of reasons. That could be either for the into livelihoods or to escape from conflict or war, famine, or natural hazards. So migration is intrinsic part of development, social transformation, and globalization. So when we talk about migration, so who makes the migration decision? So it is either individual or household that take such migration decisions. But what influences individual or household to make migration decision? So if we see the drivers, then there are different drivers, and those include macro level drivers. And in macro level drivers, there are political factors, demographic factors, socioeconomic factors, environmental factors, migration governance and policies that are beyond the control of individual and households. Likewise, there are micro level drivers, and that include individuals and households. And the next one is major level drivers, and that is in between macro and micro level drivers, and that include the factors like social networks or diasporic links, recruitment agency, geography. And when we look at this graph, what we can see is number of people migrating out of their birthplace is at all-time high. That means when we see this graph, then what we can see is in 1970, the number of international migrants was less than 100 million. But in 2019, it is about 272 million. And the total number of international migrants constitute about 3.5% of the total world population. So as I said before, the migration, when someone migrates, so many WH questions arise with it. So migration is a complex decision-making process, and it is multifaceted in nature. So to explain migration, various theories have emerged, and that explain migration at varying levels. It could be either micro level, which is more individualistic perspective. It could be either macro level, that is at a aggregate level, and another is major level, and that is at household or society level. So I'm not going into detail of each of these theory, but let me share you something about this new economics of labor migration theory as we have applied this theory in our study. So this new economics of labor migration theory views migration as a family or household strategy for diversifying income sources and well-being of the family as a whole. It also connects remittance as the impact of migration, and it is mainly applicable in developing countries. So it is also applicable in Nepalese context. So we have used this NEL theory as well as this institutional theory and network theory, which is more like the social or familial networks and contacts with the institutions such as migration intermediaries that perpetuate migration. So while talking about Nepalese migration, before talking about Nepalese migration, let me share something about Nepal. Nepal is recently stepped up into developing nations from least developed countries. So it is one of the landlocked countries in the world. It is sandwiched between China in the north and with India on all other three sides. So the border is shared with India in three other sides, and it has open border with India. The economic growth rate of Nepal is very low, persistently low. That's why employment opportunities are very less in the country. As a result, many youth every day migrate overseas for employment opportunities. And if we see this graph, although international migration has a long history in Nepal, but the government of Nepal started keeping record of international migration since 1993. So if you see this graph, what we can see is it is increasing over the years. So it reached to the peak in 2013-14 and 14-15, then it declined a bit, and that was mainly due to the earthquake that hit Nepal in 2015, and also because of some technical issues with one of the major destinations, Malaysia, for which Nepal halted the process of emigration to Malaysia for a few years. So until mid-1980s, India was the major destination for Nepalese people for employment opportunities. But in 1985, the government of Nepal endorsed Foreign Employment Act, and that diversified the destination countries beyond India. And in 1990, with people's movement, the democracy was restored, and it came up with economic liberalized policies. And also there was a conflict between the government and the Maoists since 1996 and 2006. And that also led to so many socio-political changes, and that ignited overseas migration of youth from Nepal in mid to late 2000s. So until now, over 400 million Nepalese workers have migrated overseas since last decade. So if we see the destination, so you can see Malaysia and the Gulf countries are the major destination for Nepalese people. You can see Malaysia occupying larger share in 2017-18, but there was some issue with Malaysia, so it dropped in 2018-19. Overall, the Gulf countries, they occupy about 90% of the total migrant workers from Nepal, and mostly the Nepalese workers are involved in unskilled jobs that are often called 3D, that is difficult, dirty, and dangerous jobs. Apart from that, Nepalese youth are also migrating for study purposes. So over 60,000 students have migrated to different countries in 2018-19, and Australia is the most preferred destination for Nepalese students. So going overseas for employment is one of the way that people migrate, and also going for study is increasingly becoming another conduit of migration of Nepalese youth from Nepal. So with this large scale migration, so Nepal has become able to receive huge amount of remittance. In 2020, it received $8.1 billion US, and that accounts about 24% of the total GDP. And Nepal is the top recipient of remittance in terms of GDP in South Asia, and it is in the 7th rank in the world in terms of remittance share to GDP. But it has come at the cost of appreciation of exchange rate, increasing imports and eroding export competitiveness. And since youth are migrating overseas, it has also significant impacts on agriculture, particularly labor shortages, feminization of agriculture, underutilization of agricultural land, and that has ultimately led to increased import of agricultural goods in Nepal. If you see this figure, then the import is increasing over the years. In 2021, about $3 billion US has been spent for purchasing goods from countries outside. And apart from that, this overseas migration has also made social impacts, like it has transformed gender relations and also contributed to family backgrounds. And apart from that, many migrants, they are either, they die in the overseas destination, or those who return, many of them return with injuries and physical or mental illness. And most importantly, Nepal is losing its large stock of human capital every day with this overseas migration. So the key, what we can understand from this thing is overseas migration is having consequences beyond just economic gains in Nepal. and its impacts are evident in every sphere of the society, whether it be social, economic, or political, or cultural. It is widely evident. So the study, so the aim of my study, our study, is to identify the factors that influence overseas migration decision and intensity of migration among farming households and destination choice among overseas migrants in Nepal. So if we see the research gap, most empirical studies have focused on identifying determinants of migration only, and most have not adequately considered agroecological, rural, urban, and socioeconomic diversities, including role of migration intermediaries and networks, which could be influential in decision making, migration decision making. Similarly, earlier studies have mostly used binary dependent variables such as logit or probit, and no study examined participation along with intensity of overseas migration, and only few studies have explored the destination choice of migrants in Nepal. So the contribution of this research would be enriching the understanding of migration process and achieve improved individual as well as societal outcomes of migration in Nepalese context. And next one would be methodological contribution. Since I said before, most of these studies have only looked at migration, determinants of migration using binary models. So we are using here Crack's double hurdle model that has not been used before for similar kind of research questions. So it would be also methodological contribution. So sampling techniques and data collection. So we employed multi-stage purposive sampling for selection of these sites, whereas employed stratified random sampling for selection of the households. So in this figure, you can see, first we selected, I mean, in Nepal, there are 3 agroecological zones. One is Tarai or plain area, next one is mid-hill, and the third one is mountain. But in the mountains, the population density is very low. So we selected Tarai and mid-hill, I mean, 2 agroecological zones, and from them, we selected 2 districts, one Chiton from the plain area and Kaski from the mid-hill. And then from each of these selected districts, we selected metropolitan or municipality. And while selecting this metropolitan or municipality, we selected one metropolitan that is close to district headquarters, and next one is rural municipality that is located farther away from the district headquarters. And from each of these metropolitan or municipality, we purposely selected the wards, those wards which have high rates of migration. Those wards were selected, and from each of these wards, we purposely selected the tolls or village settlements having high rates of migration. And from these tolls, we selected households, and we classified households into 3 groups. One is non-migrant household, next one is overseas migrant household, and next one is detaining migrant household. So non-migrant households are those households which do not have any member migrating overseas, while overseas migrant households are those households who have at least one member migrating overseas at least 6 months before the survey. And returning migrant households are those households who have at least one member returned from overseas before 6 months of this survey. So altogether, we surveyed 266 non-migrant households, 242 overseas migrant households, and 200 returning migrant households. But for this analysis, we have not included returning migrant households. So conceptual framework of this study. So as I said before, like there are many drivers involved in migration decision making. So in this study, we are not considering these macro level drivers. We are only considering these micro level drivers, that is individual and household characteristics, and major level drivers. So in our case, there are 3 decisions. So one is whether someone migrates from a household or not. So this one is first decision. And if someone is migrating, then if someone is migrating from the household, then how many are migrating from that household? So it is related with intensity of migration. And the next one is, where are they migrating? Destination of the migrants. So there are 3 questions in our study, and we have included the variables related with these micro level drivers and major level drivers as explanatory variables. For instance, in individual characteristics, you can see age, education, marital status, occupation before immigration that are used, but only for this destination choice analysis, whereas household characteristics such as household heads characteristics, age, ethnicity, farming experience, household human capital characteristics, demographic characteristics, physical capital characteristics, as well as migration network and institutional characteristics and geographical characteristics are used for this overseas migration and intensity analysis. So you can see asterisks in some of the variables here, and that means we have we have used the retrospective information on those variables. For instance, we generated the information 3 years before the survey period for the household, so that for instance, let's say like for the proportion of members employed or credit access, household debt asset index, including this migration network and network variables. So we generated the information 3 years before the survey period, on those households. Well, whereas asset index is created with principal component analysis. So let me go through analytical framework of study. So in our study, we have out of 508 households, 266 are non-migrant households. That means they have zero migrant, whereas 242 are overseas migrant households, and 195 households, out of them 195 have one migrant, 40 households have two migrants, and 7 households have 3 migrants. So in this case, we have both zero as well as positive values. So in such case, if appropriate econometric tools are not used in the analysis, then it may lead to biased results. So various scholars have suggested the key elements that needs to be considered while analyzing this kind of data or situation. So that include whether variable interest is a true zero or not. So in this case, if y is equal to 0, for instance, number of person migrating from a household, in our case y is number of persons migrating from a household. If it is a 0, but it is a non-observable of response, that means it could be non-observable here in non-migrant households, right? So if that is non-observable, then we should use segment sample selection method. That's what this class said. And if it is true 0, and that true 0 occurs because of the choice of the household or randomness, then we can either use Topic model, and if it is a sequential decision, whether that 0 and also like how many, or whether someone migrates from a household or not, if that are sequential, then we should go for this double hurdle model. And that's what is scholars say. And we have estimated all 3 models. So Topic model is Topic model assumes like this participation as well as intensity is affected by the same, is determined by the same variables. But this double hurdle model says there are 2 stochastic processes that determines the 2 decision process. So we have estimated all these models in our analysis and compared them based on model selection criteria. And those criteria are likelihood ratio test, and also whether there is any selection bias or not. So while doing that analysis, we found appropriateness of double hurdle model. So now I'm going to describe only about double hurdle model. So in double hurdle model, there are 2 hurdles, hurdle 1 and hurdle 2. In our case, hurdle 1 is binary decision. That means whether someone migrate from a household or not. That is hurdle 1, that is estimated using a profit model, and hurdle 2 is the number of members migrating from that household, if that household is overseas migrant household. So it is related with intensity of migration, and that is estimated using truncated regression. So here you can see the dependent variable, 2 different equations for participation and also intensity of migration decision model. So this will become 1 if it is overseas migrant household. Otherwise, it will become 0. I mean, for non-migrant household, and this will also become. This will also be a positive value if it is overseas migrant household. I mean, if this is greater than 0, or this y1 is greater than 0. So this is how double Hodel model is estimated, and this is the log likelihood function of this model. And the next one is destination choice of the overseas migrants. So out of 242 overseas migrant households, we identified 296 migrants emigrating to 26 different countries. So out of those 26 different countries, we categorize them into 3 broad overseas destinations, and that include Malaysia and the Gulf countries. The next one is East Asia and the Pacific, and the third one is wealthy Western and Asian countries. Although Malaysia lies in East Asia and the Pacific, but Malaysia and the Gulf countries are the major destination for Nepalese migrants. So we have clubbed Malaysia and Gulf together. And similarly, although this Maldives lies in South Asia, it is one of the upper middle income countries. So we clubbed it with East Asia and the Pacific countries. And similarly, Australia and New Zealand, both of them are, though Asian country, they are high income country, and their cultures are similar with other European or Western countries. So we club them with wealthy Western Asian countries. So these are 3 major destinations that we have created, and we estimated this with multinomial logic model. And we kept Malaysia and the Persian Gulf as the base category. So let me share you the results. So in this result, I'm sharing you the results from all 3 models, and all of the models have have given the similar results. So here in this green color shows the positive effect of the variables, whereas this pink color shows the negative effect of the variables. And from this result, what we can see is overseas migration decision. That means whether the household will participate in overseas migration or not. That is significantly influenced by this age of the household head. I mean, if the household heads are older, then they are more likely to participate in overseas migration. Likewise, before sharing this ethnicity of the household, let me share you something. So Brahmin, Khetri, Thakuri, we have kept this as a base category. So this Brahmin, Khetri, and Thakuri ethnic groups are in the upper hierarchy rank of, I mean, upper rank in the caste hierarchy in Nepal, and they are non-marginalized groups, and they have the best access of social, political, economic opportunities and rights. Whereas these Janjati, they are indigenous people, and this Dalit community, they are marginalized. These Dalit are even called the untouchables. So they are highly marginalized, and they are deprived of economic, social, or political opportunities in Nepal. So you can see from this community compared to this Brahmin community, the overseas migration is more likely to occur in those marginalized communities. Likewise, this proportion of members with higher education. So in a household which have higher proportion of adult members with higher education, then that is more likely to migrate overseas. Similarly, household size has also significant positive influence, and those households who have credit access, that is also having a significant positive influence. Whereas the household with higher farming experience of the household head, and those households who have higher proportion of members employed inside the country, they are less likely to migrate overseas. And if we see this intensity equation, then these 2 variables, number of educated members in the household, and the household size, that has significant positive effect on this intensity of migration, whereas this dependency ratio has significant negative effect, but it is significant only at 10% level of significance. And likewise, household debt has positive influence on overseas migration, and all these migration network and institutional contact variables, such as if whether the household had relatives abroad or not, whether the household neighbors were abroad or not, whether the household had any contact with migration intermediaries like manpower agents or not. So those having relatives abroad, neighbors abroad, and contacts, it shows they are migrating overseas. Those households are more likely to migrate overseas, and likewise those households located in the hills and those located near the district headquarters, they are also more likely to migrate overseas. Whereas those households who have irrigation access and also who are from wealthy, who are better off, or who have higher wealthy status, they are less likely to migrate overseas. So these are the key results that we obtained in our analysis. And while checking with recommended selection model, we did not find any significant effect. I mean, in this lambda, so this shows there is no any selection bias issue. So that suggested us that double hurdle model is appropriate. So this is what we got from likelihood ratio test between double hurdle model and Tobit model. And the null hypothesis is Tobit is appropriate over double hurdle, but that is rejected, and double hurdle model seemed appropriate. So the results overall suggest that households with bigger family size and higher proportion of educated members are more likely to participate in overseas migration and send more members overseas. And individuals are more likely to migrate if they are from households with aged or older heads or belong to ethnic groups that are deprived of socioeconomic and political rights, opportunities, and benefits. Similarly, households that have access to credit, familial and social networks, as well as contacts with migration intermediaries, such as manpower agencies or agents, or are located in the hill or close to district headquarters or market centers, are more likely to participate in overseas migration. Likewise, overseas migration of household members is less likely among the households with higher proportion of employed members in the household, access to irrigation, higher wealth status, or heads with more farming experience. So now let's go to the destination choice model. And in this destination choice of overseas migrants, what we can see is this EAP is East Asia and the Pacific country, WWA is wealthy Western Asian countries, and that Malaysia and Persian Gulf is the base category. So from this result, what we can see is those individuals who have higher education, or those who were engaged in study, or those who were students before emigration, and those individuals who have older household heads, and those who have larger size of land and are from wealthy households, they are more likely to choose wealthy Western and Asian countries as destination, as opposed to this common destination, Persia and Malaysia and the Persian Gulf. So this is the summary of this result. So I'm not going to repeat it here. So with this finding, so we see several policy implications, and those include, so the government should focus on establishing mechanisms to facilitate socio-economic and infrastructure development across all agroecological zones and regions, and ensure that every household individual, including marginalized groups, have equitable access to opportunities and benefits of the development. The next one is irrigation services should be extended and agricultural policies be developed to make agriculture attractive to youth and offer decent livelihood opportunities through farming. And the next one is decent income and employment opportunities in the non-farm sector should be created so that overseas migration for employment could become a choice rather than a compulsion for Nepalese youth. And then last one is focus also needs to be paid on investing in human capital like education, including ensuring a safer work environment, better protection and payoffs to the migrants abroad, and creating improved opportunities for utilizing migrants' acquired skills and remittances to maximize the development impact of migration in Nepal. So these are the key conclusions and policy implications that we derive from our study. And finally, I would like to acknowledge all the farming households, farmers, including returning migrants, for providing their valuable time and information, and also UWA for our school, members, and my fellow colleagues for helping me in many circumstances, and also NAC for granting me study leave to pursue this higher study. Thank you.
Dinesh, thank you. So questions? I'm sure there would be lots with all those models. Ben? Yeah.
I'm not going to talk about models, but is an alternative policy recommendation that the Nepalese government just tries to work to make migration cheaper because the transaction costs for individuals, speaking from personal experience, the transaction costs of migrating are significant. You know, given that migration is just going to be a fact of life for negotiate with these overseas governments to just make it cheaper for people.
I'm not sure whether the government, overseas destination countries would be agreeing on that or not, because it mainly depends on the private sector or service providers like airlines or other actors like the migration intermediaries, manpower agencies. They also charge differently. So it is not under the control of the states. But what the government should focus on is they should make sure that the migrants that they are migrating from Nepal are safe and they are secure, and they get a good environment to work and also get good reward of their work. So that's what the government should facilitate at the moment, I think.
Another question, Dave?
So, could you go back to your policy recommendations again? So the first three, I suppose, implicit in that, I guess, is that migration is a bad thing, right? That whereas the fourth one is saying we could make it better. So I guess implicit in all of them is that there's a problem with migration, right? And the response in the first three is, well, let's try and make it less of a push factor by making it more attractive for these people to stay in Nepal. And I guess you could make those recommendations irrespective of whether they're migrating, right? Migration is just a symptom of the fact that these people are having difficult and unhappy lifestyles living there. So the last one, seems very, it's a different nature, and it's quite difficult, I think, isn't it? Because you're trying to influence the behavior of
you're right, David. Actually, these three should be the priority of the government, right? But that may take time to, it may take time to achieve these three things. And until that time arrives, the government should also equally be focused on, these things. Like,
so I guess where my brain is going with this is that you need to, in terms of policy implications of your research, these are a little bit one step removed from your research. They don't actually flow directly out of your research. They have there's a further layer of interpretation and a further layer of sort of thinking that you've done beyond what you've actually researched itself. And that's fine, I'd encourage you also to have another look at your actual research results and see if you can find stuff, implications that are more tightly aligned with the research you've actually done, for one thing. And for these recommendations or implications, it would be helpful, I think, to be more transparent about the link back to your research. Right, see, at the moment, it's a bit of a jump, right?
Yeah, I would like to link this first recommendation with the findings that more people from the hill are migrating overseas. That's what our study showed. And if you look at the development in Nepal, there are less economic opportunities in the hills compared to the plain or Sarai. So if the government facilitates then equal or some sort of balanced development activities across the regions, then that might affect migration process, right? So likewise, in terms of ethnicity, those people from the marginalized groups, they are more likely to migrate overseas compared to the higher caste or non-marginalized groups.
So I agree with all this, but the problem is that a critic could say, well, you could have drawn all of those conclusions without even doing your research.
Yeah.
Those first three things, you would say that anyway, without the research.
Right? That's true.
So it's about joining them up better.
Yeah.
And looking for things that do depend on the research that you've done as well.
That's
More questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I agree with Dave because I think about evidence-based policy. The idea is that your recommendation should follow from your analysis. So, for instance, if I look at income and employability, if I had something in your model that shows, okay, this is the income that they are earning, then that would make sense. But because your model does not show what is the household income, then that is a little bit far removed from your analysis. Okay, but that's not my point. My point is that I'm still not sure, but I'm struggling with the model that you are using because the question I have is migration, is it an individual decision or a household decision? I think it is more of an individual decision than a household decision to migrate. And then when you come to the second step, you're looking at intensity of migration. The intensity of migration, so you already made an assumption that this is a household decision rather than an individual decision. So you're looking in terms of the number of individuals who have migrated from a household. But when you look at your numbers, you see that almost more than 50% is just 111, and then only 40, about 40 is where we have 2 households, and then 7 we have 3 households. So even when you are trying to measure intensity, we still see that there is no variability in that model. If I was running a regression and I look at my right-hand side, I don't see a lot of variability. I'll still be a little bit worried about what am I really getting from that model. So I think that to me is a little bit problematic. And then the assumption, because from what you have said, the double hurdle model, you're right. But the double hurdle model assumes like in the people who are migrating, the households that are migrating, maybe you would have asked them the question, is that a migrating household or not? Then if they made a rational decision that they're not going to send anyone to migrate, then it means that we have a 0, and that 0 is not a missing variable. It is indeed a rational decision that the household has decided. They have the potential, they could send somebody to migrate, but they have decided that we're not going to send somebody to migrate. So in that case, then the double hurdle model makes sense, okay? You also estimated the Tobit model, but the Tobit model, the difference between that and the Tobit model assumes that your data is going to be censored. So the Tobit model will assume that we have some zeros, but those zeros are censored variables, okay? So when I put those things together, I'm just wrestling whether you are using the right model to actually do what you're doing or not. I'm still persuaded that maybe maybe that's the reason why if you even search, you do not find any study that have tried to use the double hurdle model to do this.
On migration?
Yeah, we did not find any.
There are some that would look like, there are some studies that, for instance, would would look at individuals who have decided to migrate, then they decide how much, whether they want to remit money back home or not. And then the intensity is going to be measured in terms of what is their level of remittance. But then it's clear, you can see that's an individual decision, and then it is followed by a variable where you can actually measure the intensity. But here I'm thinking of the household. The household, there are some households 10 individuals, and other households have 5 individuals. So if you think about that intensity, it's not standardized. So I think conceptually, I'm struggling with that.
I think it's good. You take these things, especially the intensity, as Amin said. You have that 1, 2, 3. Then is a just standard. Looking at the likelihood, it looks like a standard regression. Is that the best way, or should we have something more appropriate? I don't know. Of course, then you have to have the software to do it. So that's important. So these are things that you could maybe think about. Steve?
Just to follow up for what Amin was saying, actually, it may not be obvious whether it's an individual decision or a household decision, but there's one piece of information that perhaps could have been asked is how long for those who decided to migrate or even when they returned, how long did it take them roughly to, from the first moment that they thought of migrating and then they actually migrated? So have you been thinking about it for a year, a month, 2 years? And also I would include for those returnees, after how long did they return? And this timing thing might be an interesting piece of information, together with perhaps also the household size that could be useful.
I'm going to take the rest of that for myself. Were you expecting a response or
no?
Not really. No. Okay, just quick thing. If you have a destination, 3 destinations, you said this was the best?
No.
There was the 4th one.
No, there are,
This was the best. Then why do we have options for the best?
this is not the
So this is multinomial, right? So these are individual characteristics, right?
individual.
Then shouldn't we have only 2 options?
Same question.
Pardon? Well, if this is the best, we should have only 2 sets of options, not 3.
Okay,
But
we should not.
this is again a one question. We leave that. One question I want to ask is, okay, you are only in destination where people are going and so on. Of course, if I am planning to migrate and I'm in Nepal or anywhere, of course, I cannot go to all the places I prefer to choose. Okay. So there is visa stuff. I think the research didn't say anything about that. So these people are going to these places, but there is also quotas and so on. How does that come in? And in terms of your policy stuff, you were coming with recommendations and they was talking about that, but you were silent in terms of the payoffs. Okay, so one immediate thing, something was suggests that your conclusions need to be tied to your research, right? It shouldn't be too far from your research. One of the things is, okay, is there something that the government can do to manipulate the destination so that they go to more profitable places? That would be one obvious thing. Is there something that they could have done, like in terms of agreements and so on? So visa story, the income, it's not just going outside, because it's not the same thing to go to Malaysia as it is to other places and so on. So that's, I think, important to know. So, yeah. We don't have a lot of time unless someone has a burning question that they want to start the end. You have a question? We haven't had any questions from postgrads today.
I think the framework that started was very interesting, which I was trying to look at what are the push factors. But I'm not sure how you can be able to improve this, but because you can do at you have just done at one stage, but there's a way that you can combine, for instance, regional data and cross-sectional data so that it's a 2-level analysis. And in that way, you can be able to control for factors, some of those, we call them the meso factors, because to me, those would be important. When I look at that, my question is, what are the push factors? What are the factors that are pushing them away from the farm?
Some are implicit in those.
Some of the that's the only one. That's the issue. It's the some 1,000
Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
I mean, query is more related to the macro level drivers. What that why?
Because
For
you can
zip,
still
yeah.
be able to do,
Yeah,
you can be able to combine
Yeah,
the
yeah.
two levels. And
That would be
really
interesting,
combine.
but given the time limitation and complexity, maybe, but that's valid.
Sorry,
Yeah.
why did you exclude the returns
No,
from the others?
we have separate resource question for this returning migrant. So yeah,
Okay, but in your, if I see your paper, I am entitled to ask why did you exclude them, right?
yeah, sure.
I don't know the structure of it.
Sure.
Anyway, let's stop here.
Best not to mention them.
Keep quiet, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Back.
okay. Thank you for a very interesting presentation, and thank you all for coming.